The Middle East has seen many crises, many miscalculations, and many moments when the world held its breath and prayed for cooler heads to prevail. But what is unfolding right now as of mid-March 2026 is something categorically different. It is not a skirmish. It is not a limited strike followed by a carefully managed climb down. It is a full-spectrum military campaign jointly prosecuted by the United States and Israel that has already killed more than 2,000 people across Iran, Lebanon, and Israel, closed one of the world's most critical maritime corridors, sent oil prices surging past $100 a barrel for the first time since the COVID-19 pandemic, and reshuffled the strategic deck in ways that analysts are only beginning to fully comprehend. To understand how we arrived here and where this is heading, we must trace the chain of decisions, provocations, and strategic calculations that led President Donald Trump to raise the stakes in the most dramatic fashion imaginable. The roots of this crisis stretch back further than January 2026, though that is when the immediate fuse was lit. Beginning in late December 2025, massive nationwide anti-government protests erupted in Iran, originally driven by discontent over the economic crisis. They escalated into explicit calls for the overthrow of the Islamic Republic and became the largest in scale since the 1979 revolution. The regime's response was catastrophic. More than 36,500 Iranians were killed by security forces during a two-day crackdown on nationwide protests on January 8th and 9th. The world watched in horror. Washington watched with something else: strategic opportunity. On January 2nd, 2026, Trump threatened a lock-and-loaded military intervention in Iran if the government decided to kill peaceful protesters. Those were not empty words. Trump's entire second-term Iran policy had been one of relentless, escalating pressure. Iran's nuclear program had remained a central pillar of President Trump's strategic calculus. On June 22nd of the previous year, in Operation Midnight Hammer, the U.S. had carried out direct strikes on Iranian nuclear facilities, marking a decisive escalation in Washington's effort to deny Tehran any viable path toward nuclear breakout. The protests gave Trump a new political and moral dimension to layer onto a confrontation that was already deeply military in character. By January 23rd, Trump announced that a U.S. armada was heading toward the region. By mid-February, a second carrier strike group, the USS Gerald R. Ford, was dispatched. The military footprint in the Persian Gulf was reaching levels not seen since the opening of the Iraq War in 2003. Diplomacy in parallel was occurring, but it was fragile and ultimately illusory. On February 25, 2026, Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi stated that a historic agreement with the United States was within reach ahead of renewed talks in Geneva, emphasizing that diplomacy must be prioritized. But the clock was ticking. On February 20th, President Trump issued a 10-day deadline for a deal. On February 28th, following unsatisfactory results in the third round of negotiations, the United States and Israel conducted military strikes in Iran. As the Council on Foreign Relations noted, it would not be unreasonable for Iranian officials to assume that diplomacy was a mere ruse before the bombs fell. What happened on February 28, 2026, was unlike anything the modern Middle East had witnessed. Operation Epic Fury, the U.S. code name for its joint military operations with Israel against Iran, opened with a salvo that took out the heart of the Iranian regime. Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei was killed, triggering a torrent of hundreds of retaliatory missiles and thousands of drones from Iran across the Middle East. The stated objectives from Washington were precise and sweeping in equal measure. President Trump declared that the objectives were to destroy Iran's missile capabilities and capacity to produce them, to annihilate their navy, and to ensure that the world's leading state sponsor of terrorism would never obtain a nuclear weapon. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff General Dan Kane reinforced those objectives at the Pentagon, describing the operation as designed to dismantle Iran's ability to project power outside of its borders, both today and in the future. And in the military architecture behind Operation Epic Fury represents the full depth of American hard power. The U.S. has attacked more than 6,000 targets since the operation began, with strike packages steadily launching every hour, according to General Kane. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth underscored the breadth of the arsenal being deployed, citing AI, cyber, space, electronic warfare, and counter-drone capabilities as active components of the campaign. By March 13th, the campaign had reached its most intense phase. Hegseth told reporters that the U.S. was sending its highest number of fighters and bombers yet, and that today will be, yet again, our most intense day of strikes inside Iran. In just one 72-hour window, America's bomber force struck nearly 200 targets deep inside Iran. Iran's retaliation has been ferocious but increasingly degraded. Open-source intelligence tracking suggests that by March 5th, the Islamic Republic had already launched roughly 585 ballistic missiles and 1,522 drones. In the opening stages of the conflict, Tehran directed roughly 40% of its missile launches at Israel. Retaliatory missile and drone strikes by Iran targeted U.S. embassies and military installations in the UAE, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, Kuwait, Bahrain, Iraq, Oman, and Jordan. Iran's strategy of horizontal escalation, striking as wide a geographic arc as possible, was designed to force a political cost on America's regional partners and ultimately on Washington itself. Iran has targeted the sensor network and radar infrastructure that sustains American forces throughout the Middle East, including key ANTPY-2 radar sites in Jordan, Qatar, the UAE, and Saudi Arabia. These are not symbolic strikes. They are precision attacks on the nervous system of American power projection in the Gulf. But Iran's most dangerous asymmetric card is the one it has now played in the maritime domain. On March 2nd, a senior IRGC official confirmed that the Strait of Hormuz was closed and threatened any ship that attempted to pass through it. The consequences were immediate and global. Tanker traffic dropped first by approximately 70% before falling to near zero, disrupting roughly 20% of the world's daily oil supply and significant volumes of liquefied natural gas. Oil prices surged to $114 per barrel, their highest since the COVID-19 pandemic. Qatar's energy minister warned that if the war continues, Gulf energy producers may be forced to declare force majeure, which could bring down economies of the world. The IRGC has explicitly framed its strategy as a war on energy supplies, with kinetic targeting expanding to oil and gas infrastructure, desalination facilities, and water supply systems across the Gulf. Trump's response to the maritime threat has been characteristically direct and escalatory. President Trump announced that U.S. forces had obliterated targets on Iran's Karg Island, home to the main terminal that handles the country's oil exports. He followed that with stark warnings. If Iran interferes with shipping through the Strait of Hormuz, he would reconsider his decision not to strike Iran's broader oil infrastructure. Meanwhile, elements from the 31st Marine Expeditionary Unit and the amphibious assault ship USS Tripoli have been ordered to the Middle East. An additional 2,500 Marines are en route. The deployment of a Marine Expeditionary Unit capable of amphibious landings, embassy security, and civilian evacuation signals that Washington is preparing for multiple contingencies simultaneously. The conflict's expansion toward NATO's perimeter represents perhaps the most alarming strategic development. Tehran launched a ballistic missile toward Turkey, a NATO member that hosts key Allied assets, including an airborne warning and control system, a forward-deployed X-band radar installation, NATO's Allied Land Command headquarters, and the strategically vital Incirlik Air Base. The USS Oscar Austin, a U.S. Navy destroyer, shot down an Iranian ballistic missile over Turkey, the third such interception over the NATO member in the span of 2 weeks. Each of those intercepts is a near miss on Article 5. Each one is a moment where, under slightly different targeting data or a slightly degraded missile defense system, the entire alliance could have been drawn in. Analysts at the Hudson Institute have noted that any sustained Iranian missile campaign against Turkish territory would raise escalation risk significantly, potentially triggering greater NATO involvement. Europe's response has been fractured and revealing. On March 5th, France authorized American armed forces to use French bases amid the war and called for Iran to immediately cease its strikes. Spain, by contrast, denied the use of its military bases for U.S. flights connected to a military offensive against Iran, leading President Trump to threaten economic retaliation. This internal NATO tension between members who see the operation as a legitimate effort to neutralize a nuclear threshold state and those who view it as an illegal war of aggression will outlast the conflict itself. The question of NATO solidarity, already strained by Trump's first term and his transactional view of alliance commitments, is now under a new and entirely different kind of stress. Not the slow erosion of burden-sharing disputes, but the immediate fracture of a war in progress. The killing of Supreme Leader Khamenei has not produced regime collapse. Trump expressed disappointment that Iran named Mojtaba Khamenei, the son of the killed Ayatollah, as its new supreme leader, saying, "I was disappointed because we think it's going to lead to just more of the same problem." The regime's resilience reflects a structural reality that strategic bombing advocates have historically underestimated. No matter how precise or devastating, airstrikes alone have never toppled a government. History reinforces this lesson. When a government believes it is fighting for its survival, it does not capitulate. Iran in 2026, battered as it is, appears to be calculating that if it can sustain costs on the United States long enough, in blood, in treasure, in global economic disruption, Washington will eventually seek an exit. Iran appears to be holding out, believing the U.S. will eventually quit the fight. The cyber and information dimensions of this conflict, while less visible, are no less consequential. Infrastructure targeting has expanded beyond energy and communications to include water desalination facilities and cloud and data infrastructure, highlighting the growing risk to civilian survival systems and regional economic stability. Iran's use of sea drones, loitering munitions, and swarm tactics in the Strait of Hormuz has demonstrated that asymmetric maritime warfare has fundamentally changed the calculus of controlling that waterway. The use of aerial and sea drones by Iran has changed the dynamics of security in the Strait of Hormuz, and the U.S. Navy has not yet begun to escort oil tankers through the strait. The mine-laying threat looms as well. Though large-scale mining operations have not yet been confirmed, even the threat of mines has been sufficient to drive insurance premiums to prohibitive levels and bring tanker traffic to a near halt. The strategic conclusion that emerges from this analysis is as sobering as it is clear. Operation Epic Fury represents the most consequential American military decision since the 2003 invasion of Iraq, and it carries within it the same dangerous contradiction: overwhelming tactical military power applied to a political problem that cannot be resolved by military power alone. The United States has degraded Iran's missile arsenal, destroyed much of its navy, killed its supreme leader, and struck its most vital economic infrastructure. Yet Iran has not collapsed, has not surrendered, and has not ceased its retaliation. It has instead activated every asymmetric lever at its disposal: maritime disruption, proxy escalation, regional terror, and energy warfare, in a calculated effort to impose costs that Washington did not fully anticipate. The Strait of Hormuz crisis alone threatens a global recession. The Lebanon front is metastasizing. NATO's eastern flank is absorbing Iranian missiles, and the new supreme leader has already vowed revenge. Trump is raising the stakes strike by strike, day by day. Whether that pressure produces a decisive Iranian capitulation, a negotiated endgame from a position of strength, or a deeper spiral into a conflict that reshapes the global order remains the defining strategic question of this moment. What is certain is that the world in March 2026 is navigating waters as dangerous as any since the Cold War, and the next 48 hours in the skies over Tehran, in the waters of the Strait of Hormuz, and in the corridors of NATO capitals will do much to determine which direction history turns.